the inaugural chairperson and chief scientific advisor for Ending Loneliness Together, a national Australian network made up of universities and industry partners. She's a Victorian-based, yes, psychologist, and is considered the leading Australian scientific expert in loneliness, with more than 80 national media appearances to date. I saw her on ABC Quanda. She's a research fellow at the Inversion Health Innovation Research Institute and Centre for Mental Health at Swinburne University of Technology, the Director of Social Health and Wellbeing SHAW laboratory, which generates evidence-based research in loneliness. And this involves understanding the drivers of loneliness over time and developing consumer relevant and effective digital interventions to reduce loneliness. So welcome so much. Thank you so much for being here, Michelle. Our other three panel members, Monty. Welcome, Monty. I've heard so much about you. Monty is a local anthropologist and the founder of Habitus, a social enterprise that uses anthropology, emotional intelligence, and educational psychology to unlock your human potential. Sounds very exciting. Monty combines evolutionary evidence and cross-cultural research to demonstrate how our creativity, diversity, and imperfection is actually the secret to our adaptability and success as a species. He spent most of his research living with the Paniya, a marginalised Indigenous group in India. However, he now works closer to home, where he delivers transformative workshops that help people put more meaning to joy back in their lives.
Thank you, Liz, for that question. Just to acknowledge, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation over here in Victoria, who are the traditional owners. So loneliness, by definition, is defined as subjective feelings of social isolation. So you feel your relationships are not meeting your current social needs, whether it's in terms of quantity, but more so around quality. So you feel like that's falling short in terms of what you feel you need to have a meaningful social connection. So this has to be a little bit different and differentiated from social isolation, which is very much more of an objective indicator. So that's a little bit more obvious when we know, how many people you know, or how many people you live with, or the degree of contact you might have with someone on a daily basis. That's very much more obvious with social isolation, but much less obvious when it comes to loneliness.
Right. Fantastic. So what is you've articulated a differentiation there between actual loneliness and social isolation. So loneliness is that subjective, how you are feeling, and isolation, that objective measure of the people around you. Yeah? Have I got
yes.
That? Okay. Yes. So what does your research discovered about loneliness, its causes, and the impacts for people?
Yeah, look, I think it's very fair to acknowledge that loneliness is part of the human condition. This is not something that is new. It's actually, I often say, it's baked into our DNA. We are all meant to feel lonely, but I would say in the last 20 years, there's emerging, accelerating evidence around the detrimental impact loneliness itself can have on health and our quality of life and our community. So more traditionally, in terms of the scientific field, the impact of social isolation is well demonstrated. We know that if you're socially isolated, you will have poorer health outcomes because, then you might have fewer people to kind of nag you to exercise or eat better or to do things and to be active. We're less motivated because we have fewer people around us. But what the research has been saying is it's not just being socially isolated. In fact, the detrimental impacts on an earlier death is very similar if you just felt lonely. So you could be living in a household, you could be married, you could be living in an urban society, you could be working, but if you felt you were not meaningfully connected, you're still about 26% more likely to die of an earlier death. In addition to that, loneliness is obviously processed in our brain as some sort of stressor, because what we're finding is that if you're lonely at an earlier time point, you're more likely to have high levels of depression, high levels of social anxiety, high levels of paranoia, just in terms of your mental health. In terms of physical health, the biggest, most robust evidence is that loneliness predicts poorer cardiovascular health and also type 2 diabetes. So lots of big, large population data sets have shown that in about 5 years, if I am lonely, I'm more likely to have heart disease. I'm more likely to have type 2 diabetes, which is very interesting and really kind of puts the term lonely hearts, with some meaning, because it really does stress our heart. I've got to go back down to, the loneliness as a bit of and Monty can talk a little bit more about this, but as an evolutionary signal for us to do something different. And what happens is that when we ignore it, or if we kind of layer on some of the common misconceptions of what we think loneliness is and not seek help, what happens is that persistent, enduring, even if it's a low level, is likely to actually cause more problems down the track. And it's almost this idea of having increased cortisol, stress hormones that's persistently in your body because you feel like no one's got your back. If you even think about the way we navigate our environment, whether we're by ourselves or with someone else we trust, we know that it influences even things like our ability to cope with pain, our ability to, more stressful situations. When we know that someone's with us, supporting us, got our back. So we process information differently when we feel we're meaningfully connected.
Yeah. So, Michelle, thank you so much. I loved your analysis and your description. It was incredibly engaging and me. So thank you. And I think, the whole idea that loneliness is stress-inducing and does release cortisol, it is this powerful indicator that we need to do something. I think, I love the distinction that you make between loneliness and social isolation. I think throughout history, we've got examples of the way in which loneliness is very different to being alone. You can be alone and not feel lonely. You can be surrounded by people and feel incredibly disconnected and alone. And I think being alone, and there are aspects of aloneness that humans have chosen to be engaged in, through forms of solitude, meaningful reflection, which are incredibly therapeutic and incredibly powerful and can create a sense of connection to place, purpose, belonging, all those other things. And it is that idea that Michelle said about disconnection, creating the stress that releases the cortisol, that makes our body think, well, I've got to do something here. And we know that those elevated levels of cortisol and the stress, obviously the evidence that you brought up, Michelle, is overwhelming, that we age quicker, we have physical ailments, that we have a range of comorbidities that are exacerbated through the release of those hormones. And this is where we look at the embodied disposition or the lived experience of loneliness as being, an incredibly, not just a challenging experience, but absolutely something that affects our health. When we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, the opposite. Please, I know that this is going to sound overly simplified, Michelle, but the opposite to cortisol for us is oxytocin. So, what happens when we have that sense of stress and disconnection is that there is a need to reconnect. And when we do reconnect, we produce these wonderful connector chemicals known as oxytocin, which makes us feel like we're a part of something. And that oxytocin can be released when we're with other people, or when, as we say, we connect to nature, or we connect to purpose, or we connect to a sense of meaning and belonging. So from an evolutionary perspective, we see this interesting relationship between disconnection and connection, between, what's happening in our body and the chemicals that are released, and how those chemicals kind of create a sensation that propel us into action, or sometimes inaction, that moves us closer to connection in order to bring about that sense of balance and equilibrium again.
take it one step further and say meaningful social connection. So I've been in mental health, public mental health, and in that field for 17, 18 years now. And there have been points in my life where I would see a client 2 or 3 times a day because this person's extremely unwell. And despite the fact this person sees services 3 times a day for medication purposes or living with family, they would still constantly complain about feeling lonely. That's because they don't have that meaningful social connection. And when we say that, it's about building those connections, and we tend to build those connections over time. But what's happened is that people often have unrealistic expectations of what is needed to actually establish those connections, and often perhaps even fear the little steps that they should be taking, like little, things like small talk. Often people say, I don't want to do the small talk, I just want to have a real connection. But actually the small talk serves as a function to then establish that meaningful social connection. So a lot of it is trying to get people to understand that actually relationships take work. That's actually one of the more difficult things, and that we constantly have to do, and it's well worth the investment, whether it's with our family, our friends, our colleagues. Every relationship that we have is a dynamic, and it does take work to have that, to build meaningful social connection. And it's something that we just forget sometimes. It's not that we don't have skills, it's that we do not put in the effort.
Is that the case, that we forget or we don't put the effort in, or are we living in a society that's actually lost that skill set?
Yeah, and there's a combination of many factors. So loneliness is often a consequence of anything from all the way from brain biology to genetics, to your living situation, to your mental health status, and maybe perhaps even having trauma in the past, your physical health status, which stops you from getting around, and very strong relationship to your socioeconomic status, where we can see a clear dose response that people who are more socially disadvantaged report high levels of loneliness. This is across international data as well as Australian data. So everyone carries risk factors, and these risk factors interact with each other. But how we experience and navigate is really about our skill set and our intention to actually do something different, and perhaps even lay it on with what kind of beliefs we have about us feeling lonely, because often people, I think Monty mentioned the lived experience of which is crucial and fundamental to understanding how we can actually address loneliness, because a lot of people who are lonely feel they are a burden. They don't want to actively reach out or be, clearly saying, I need a connection and having this coffee is very important to me. They are not verbalizing those things because of perceptions of stigma, of feeling like they're burned. Somehow I'm a loser if I feel lonely. And we have a lot to do in the community to really address the stigma so that people who do feel lonely can feel safe to ask for that meaningful connection, and to take steps towards building meaningful social connection.
This idea of psychological and emotional safety through which to create sort of meaningful, affective human connections is such an important aspect of this. I think, in a lot of the work that we do, so just for context, I'm a medical anthropologist. So we look not only at the way in which a range of social, political, economic factors create the conditions for the manifestation of health issues, but we look at how, people's position within a social framework can affect their access to health, for example, and therefore their need to access different forms of therapeutic practice in order to get their health needs met. And in particular, the work that I did with Indigenous communities, we did a lot of stuff around, high rates of suicide, high rates of infant mortality, substance use, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I was able to pick up from that research and that we bring into the work that we do now is, for example, the opposite to addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. So when dealing with things like addiction or certain social issues, rather than let me just frame it up. So creating a social connection gives us the vehicle through which we can actually transcend those afflictions. and they give us the sense of purpose that enables us to have a direction around that. And a lot of the stuff I do with young people, it really is framed around this idea that young people are embedded in these social networks, and that sometimes even being embedded in a group of people can create a sort of a social pressure to conform, and that conformity and that social pressure to conform, or the norms that we interpret from that experience, can actually create a sense of disconnection, because what's happening is people have their lived subjective experience of stuff, but there are all these sort of, as Michelle said, there's stigma, there are these sort of acceptable words or practices or habits or norms about things that we can talk about that stop people saying, well, actually, I don't feel great, or I am a little confused, or I'm not always on top of it, right? And that creates a sense of disconnection, the kind of disconnection that I see a lot when I'm working with young people. And I think when like the work that we focus on is all about creating those meaningful connections using a couple of old school strategies, right? Like we connect through stories. One of the things we know is that stories often have this narrative arc where you've got this point of tension and then a resolve. A great story always has that, right? And so what happens in that point where there's that tension is that cortisol actually is released from the body. Again, cortisol is like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And then when it resolves, we get that oxytocin that makes us feel a lot better. What we know is that when we have stories that have that narrative arc, it doesn't just change brain chemistry, it changes behavior. We know that people that have had that narrative arc in storytelling are actually more inclined to go and give to charity, for example, after they've heard that story. And so we use that science to help frame the activities that we do in our programs to kind of get people to connect through their stories, to sit with some of the challenging aspects of those stories, and to create real connections in their bodies through the changing of that brain chemistry, through the sharing of authentic, vulnerable, honest stories. But in order to do that, they have to feel safe to do that first. And so, you know, you're absolutely right, Michelle. We've got to have those meaningful connections, but having a structure that helps people sort of step into those meaningful connections is essential.
As a psychologist, we often ask what's wrong with someone, but actually what we need to be asking is what's right. What's right with you, what's going well, and what can we do to harness those strengths so that you can build. And I think when we ask the right questions, we destigmatize what might be going on with them, but also we boost their social confidence. And this approach has been amazing with young people who are just so sick of people asking them what's wrong. When are they going to kill themselves, how depressed they are, how anxious we are. But when we actually say, what's right with you, what can you use your existing strengths to then nurture and harness those relationships you have, even if it's with a parent. We don't have to make new friends. Perhaps it's just a family member that you just want to improve that quality of relationship and then take it from there. And Nicole, that's actually really the approach that we've been kind of taking, is that kind of, flourish and thrive kind of approach, and kind of that strengths-based approach, which has been much more amazing and effective.
Yeah, absolutely, Michelle. And that's what we do. That's the practice that we follow here at Flourish, is that we're very much a strengths-based service, and we focus on people's strengths. So when they come to us, it's not about the problem. It's not about what they're lacking. It's what strengths can we identify in yourself, and how can we build on those? And I think that's really important. You're absolutely right. And that helps them to feel that connectiveness, and helps them with their self-esteem and that feeling of belonging. And create that space for safety also.
COVID went down, right? So all of our stuff is face-to-face, all about creating authentic, vulnerable human connection. And when COVID went down, we're like, holy shirt balls, what are we going to do? And we were able to really use Zoom and technology to recreate those connections. So I think there's a tendency, so there's a couple of things going on that I see when I'm working with young people. Moral panic. We love to have moral panic over stuff. When I was a kid, it was Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music, which I was really into. Right now, I would love my kids to be into Dungeons and Dragons. As it turns out, heavy metal didn't destroy the world. I'm not trying to invalidate the pressures or the challenges of having, technology. But I also know that we like to look to things to blame, and we like to have simple, linear, causal variables to go, that's the problem, that's the thing, we need to change that, as opposed to looking at ourselves and looking at the fact that nothing is inherently good or bad. that technology actually, you know, when I talk to young people, I say, what's one thing you would like your parents to know or chill out about? And they go, well, guess what, mum and dad, you're just as addicted to technology as I am. So, you know, stop telling me to put my phone down. Second of all, you know, like actually this technology is the primary method through which we connect to our friends. I hear my son talking on, I don't know, whatever the game is, right? Like, and he's talking to his friends. They're problem solving, they're team building, they're managing conflict, doing a whole heap of stuff. But we're not seeing that. We're just seeing this thing that we think is a pathology or a deficit, and along with the way that we analyze that and talk about that to our kids comes a lot of shame and added pressure. We don't realize that when we're pathologizing what they're doing, we're putting more pressure on them. And again, it's like, well, maybe there's more to it than just blaming technology. There is evidence, as Michelle said, there's a lot of mixed evidence out there. But I think, you know, one of the things I know is that when we shift from that deficit discourse, hanging out with our kids, and we actually connect in with a more of a strength-based, asset-based mentality, our kids are really freaking clever, and they're actually quite savvy about this sort of stuff. And they can teach us a million things in a heartbeat about it. And if we just sort of if we just chilled out a bit, we might actually see how awesome they are. Because humans are incredibly resilient and incredibly adaptable. And right now our kids are adapting to a changing world. And you know, we need to give them a bit of credit for that. So again, look, I've gone off on a bit of a rant, but I think we can demonize at the cost of really reflecting on our contribution to it all, and how the social pressures and norms that we're trying to conform to when we read all those bloody parenting things that say we have to do this and we have to do that. You know, how about we put our phone down and just, you know, tell our kids a story, and maybe that will invite them to share their story with us, as opposed to sitting at them, looking in their eyes and going, tell me about your day, or put down your phone. You know, we're all having that very negative, punitive, deficit style relationship with them. And I believe we have opportunities to do more.
I actually a strong believer that we don't access community, all sorts of support within the community as much as we should. We know that from the Australian Loneliness Report, 1 in 2 Australians actually don't know their neighbour. They don't know who they live with, and that's an issue. I think there's a huge source of support here that we're lacking, and we know. I did a study actually during COVID. This is an international, randomized controlled trial on the impact of kindness on neighbors. And we found that that people who were, just giving regular emotional support, some of them instrumental support, they reported themselves less loneliness. So the giver of those kind acts actually received themselves by just being kind neighbor and doing something nice during COVID.
So it was equally. So you're saying it was equally supportive of the giver and the receiver?
Just the measure in case the giver and the impact of giving the community or being kind to the neighbor.
Right.
Found that they actually were less after the intervention. And we know these things already. We know that being kind to your neighbor will reap benefits for your well-being, but it's very hard to study these large, I guess the wide-scale impact of giving, for example. But I feel very strongly that we need to really tap into community solutions. It's not always about working with the individual. That's just one part of it, but solutions and helping strengthen the weaker ties, not just looking out for our friends and our family, but beyond that, looking out for the people that we live with, has huge benefits to actually reducing our own loneliness.
lot of stuff in anthropology around gift giving and exchange, and how gift giving actually situates us within webs of reciprocity and exchange that actually strengthen social ties. We also know that in the act of gift giving, you know, it's not the receiver is not just the only beneficiary of the gift; it's the giver as well. And you know, when we connect that in with a positive psychology framework, you know, the act of appreciation and creates the kind of positive psychology, positive emotions that are really important for our own individual resilience. I get a lot out of giving stuff to people. It takes time to think about that person. It's a reflection of sort of my intimate knowledge of them, the selection of the gift, you know, the wrapping, the energy, the effort, the meaning that I put into that as I exchange that gift, and how that's then interpreted by them adds to that meaning-making process of gift giving. And this is really important because, you know, appreciation, honoring, gratitude, these are all things that we do that can actually maximize the impact of, or increase those positive emotions, positive psychological emotions, and improve affect, improve outcomes. But when we turn to this question of social cohesion, I think I always struggle with this idea of solutional programs. I get a bit triggered around it because I'm not so into solutions. I actually struggle with I prefer processes. And I think that, you know, when we're looking at social cohesion, like for me, I think about the importance of inclusion and belonging and diversity, but a big part of that is healthy conflict, which means things aren't always going to be smooth and cohesive. And it would be great. And this is where, from an anthropological perspective, we look at how gift giving and exchange actually helps to mitigate some of those necessary human conflicts that are an essential part of having a vibrant, healthy, diverse community. And so, you know, I think, you know, when I think about programs, and we run Brave Conversations programs, we run conversations that are all about how to disagree, about how to do so safely, and really, they're nothing magical. They're just coming back to some of the things that, like, you know, I want to be really clear. I don't believe that there is an essential human nature. I think the only thing essentially human is our variability, our ability to do things differently, our ability to do things one way and to decouple from that, imagine new ways of doing things in order to adapt and change to new challenging circumstances. But what I do know is that something that humans have done a lot throughout history and across cultures is connect authentically and vulnerably through stories. We've had the opportunity to learn through play and improvisation and experimentation. And what I know is that if we set the conditions where people feel psychologically and emotionally safe to connect, then we don't need to have the answers. We just create those opportunities, and the people actually, they take it to where it needs to go. And when we look at what's happening in the brain, and when we look at what's happening in the body, you know, those interactions, they create the oxytocin that we need to feel connected. They help us to actually deal with the cortisol when it emerges, because we don't want to get rid of it. We want to learn how to deal with conflict. We want to learn how to deal with stress. We want to learn how to use these natural things in our bodies to have a more meaningful engagement with each other, a more meaningful engagement with ourselves, and a more meaningful engagement with the world around us.